Hello, my name is Jafreen Khan, and for this particular conference, I have chosen to talk on unconscionable indenture contracts. I must also tell you that this research is still a work in progress, and at this stage, the findings that I will discuss with you are a result of an exploratory research that I began with to understand the topic and also to investigate a problem which I feel is not clearly defined. Law affects almost all aspects of our lives, and the indenture system was no exception. For this presentation, I have chosen to discuss three important acts that shaped the indenture system and also the indenture contracts to a very large degree. Uh, I would discuss the Amelioration Act of 1798 and the second legislation, which in my abstract would read as Emancipation Act of 1861, in fact should have read uh, Emancipation Act of 1834. My apologies for that. And along with that, I will also discuss the Sugar Equalization Act 1846. After analyzing the provisions of these particular acts, I have come to a conclusion that the whole system of indenture was not bad, but it was a greatly misused system that created an off balance of power between employers and the laborers. Nishant Pacha, in his PhD thesis, has rightfully pointed out that to understand the indenture system, the recognition of laws and rules at colonial and imperial level is essential. It fits in very well with what Bogart also has stated, and according to him, law asserts an influence on society, and that is scarcely an issue. But how it does so, the effect that is produced, and the gauging of those impacts raise complex questions to which there are frequently few easy answers. Difficult issues are involving, including the determination of causation and the assessment of the outcomes. I have been greatly inspired by Nishant Pacha's work and also what Bogart has said in this particular regard. According to Trevor Bernard and Kit Kenlin's publication in 2018, the period between 1790s to 1830s is considered a very crucial period in the history of British Empire because of three important reasons. The first, there was determination on how the labor would be organized in the 19th century. Second, there was decision made on whether labor trade will be based on slavery or free will. And the third one, which related to the gangs remaining in the cane fields, or would this system be replaced by paid, or I should say cheap paid labor, and that would be based on the Asian model. Hence, to remove slavery, the Slavery Amelioration Act of 1798 could be called an excellent attempt at extending basic human rights to slaves and also in trying to improve their conditions. Some very good examples are like lighter chores were allocated to pregnant women. There were punishments for employers and planters who used excessive force or violence on laborers. And essentially, the act allowed for compensation for wrongs to slaves. And on a very rare occasion, there was death penalty also enforced. Um, I, however, have a major criticism in relation to what I have found and what I have researched in relation to the Slavery Amelioration Act of 1798. And it is that on the face of it, it looks like that this act would create a fair working environment and condition for the slaves, but it was just an attempt by the British government to calm down the rebellion in the British Caribbean colonies. In fact, it was not out of their kindness. In fact, it was a two-phase process where there were some planters who were genuinely concerned about the human rights and the working conditions of the laborers or the slaves, I should say. And then there were abolitionists and also movements that saw, abolishing of slavery as one of the major and important ways of extending basic human rights to the slaves and also improving the labor system. On 28th August 1833, the Slavery Abolition Law received royal assent. The decision to end the practice of slavery to an end was a contentious one. Since the 16th century, British Empire had used slaves to cultivate products such as sugar and cotton, and there was heavy reliance on slaves to cultivate products in the global market. And after this act came into force, there was an expectation that it will free slaves and allow them the freedom to become apprentices. In fact, initially the reality was that it was only the children below the age of 6 who were freed, and later the thousands that were slaves in the British West Indies were freed as well. The criticism of the Emancipation Act of 1834 was that despite gaining the status of apprentices rather than slaves, the masters continued to ill-treat the apprentices and exploit them. And then there were different classes of apprentices. So technically, there really wasn't any freedom if you are still divided into classes. The appreciation for this system, though, is that with the apprenticeship system, there was eventually abolishment of the whole entire system of slavery on the basis of unconscionability. And Nishant Pacha has written a lot about it. Legally, if contracts are unconscionable, then it is so severely one-sided and unfair to one of the parties that it can be deemed unenforceable under the law. And with the termination of apprenticeship, slavery was abolished. So what the British government ended up doing was that they paid compensation to the slave owners in the amount of 20 million pounds, which was almost 40% of the government total expenditure at that given point in time. The effect of the Emancipation Act of 1834 was that it led to severe shortage of labor. There was a pressure put by the planters on the British colonial authorities to introduce the system of indentured laborers. And in fact, D'Souza in 2000 has written that the origin of Indian indentured labor or the coolie system was or can be traced to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire due to the Emancipation Act. After the abolishment of the slavery system, the planters were in real trouble. The main problem for that was to seek labor at the lowest cost and in return achieve highest productivity. Now, if that wasn't enough, what really happened was that the Sugar Equalization Act of 1864 actually removed protection for sugar from the British colonies. And the removal of tariff meant free trade, and sugar was considered the most important commercial product of the British colonies at that given point in time. So initially the argument was that the removal of tariff will actually cause expansion of slave trade. And there was a time when the sugar industry was supposedly called to be jeopardized but not fully destroyed. There was economic downfall just because of the Sugar Equalization Act and this act removing tariff from sugar. However, this act combined with the abolition of slavery meant that the planters were forced to double output because of the price of sugar had fallen. And what was the solution? The solution simply meant to seek Indian and Asian laborers to meet these output goals. As I had stated earlier, the origin of Indian indentured labour, also known as coolie in British colonies, can be traced to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire by the Act of Emancipation 1834, and this combined with the removal of the sugar tariff created a need for labour. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I've only chosen to discuss Fiji because of time limitation, but there was an interesting thing that I came across during the research. In fact, before the coolie or the Indian indenture system in Fiji, there was already an existing Pacific Islander indenture system. Now, there were different perceptions in relation to both these systems. So, via a way of comparison, I would like to discuss how were these two systems different. So, how were the Pacific Islander and the indenture system different? The Pacific Islander system did not have any government supervising the recruiting process, and the meaning of contract made very little difference to them. So, in comparison, the Indian indenture system was supervised. In fact, the recruiting system was supervised. The government kept a watchful eye on the conditions of work, and there was an assumption that the laborers in the system were from civilized societies, so they knew the contract terms and meaning of traveling to an overseas country with the hope of improvement to life and improvement to earning as well. I would also like to highlight at this point that the consuls usually were present when the native laborers signed the contracts, but they never had the legal authority to compel the planters or the employers to fulfill the terms of the agreement. The fulfillment depended entirely on the willingness of the planters to recognize them as binding. On the contrary, the third point, where my cursor is hovering over the screen at the moment, in relation to Indian indenture system, was that the laborers in this system, because they were from a civil society or a civil society, they knew what they were getting into or the type of contract that they were signing, or were they? The indenture system is over, but there are still lingering questions whether the system was good or bad. Do you remember the Tinker and Gillian debate, which still is going on? Now, through my research, I've discovered that there is a publication by Hui and Kampapati who called this indenture system a new system which was more like a compromise between the unacceptable slavery and free labor. They have argued that the indenture system was a compromise because even though it facilitated free trade and some freedom of movement, it was hard to justify in terms of individual liberty. And I also agree with their viewpoint because they state that the system was not bad. It was just the way the system was misused that created problems. So the indenture system that was sponsored by the Britain or the British government was superior to forms of unfree labor that other colonies practiced. But still, there was more freedom rather than less. Indenture system might have been superior to slavery, but it was based on a contract, that was a legally binding document. And in my opinion, it is the indenture contract that was the problem. I believe that the indenture contracts were unconscionable. And by saying unconscionable, what I mean is that the contract was one-sided, which left one of the parties with no real meaningful choice, typically due to significant differences in bargaining power between the parties to the contract. And one of the main characteristics of unconscionable contracts is that one of the parties who signed the contract is in a situation that involves pressure, lack of information, or because of being misled or there was some form of misrepresentation. I am basing my opinion on calling the indenture contracts unconscionable for two major reasons. Number one being asymmetric information that was provided to the laborers and also the asymmetric bargaining power that existed. So, as part of my evidence gathering process or research, uh, I found very thick literature out there which states that there was lack of information about where the laborers were going. And then, particularly, Dickens Committee report speaks of deceit and lies in the recruitment process. Then the Gagan's report of 1875 speaks about the kidnapping of laborers. And C.F. Andrews and Pearson's 1990 reporting also indicated that there was coercion in the recruitment process. Besides that, when I'm talking about the bargaining power, which has a lot to do with unconscionability, there were wages decided, yes, but the interest of both parties was not considered as part of the indenture contract. The collective bargaining power of the planters at all times was greater than the laborers. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that my research is still work in progress and it still requires further research to prove with evidence that the indenture contracts were unconscionable. However, I still maintain that the system was not bad, but it was the way it was abused that led to many problems and the sufferings for the laborers. As I continue on this journey, the following four remain key questions in my area of research, and they all have to do with indenture contract unconscionability. Thank you for listening. I will now take any questions or comments that you might have. And if you can't ask me any questions right now, my email address is jafreenk@unifiji.ac.fj. I will be happy to receive an email from you and clarify your doubts if there are any. Thank you.